if all goes well. All right, people are starting to join. We'll get started very, very soon. Alex, how are you doing?
I'm doing pretty well. How about you?
You know, I mean, aside from waking up at 5:30 thinking it was time for me to get ready and having a minor little freak out, it's actually going really, really well. Although I'm glad when things get back to normal a bit more. What about you, Margot? How are you doing?
Yeah, pretty good. Excited to go back to school and start seeing people again now.
I miss seeing people at more than just pixelated online resolutions. So it's going to be good to see some of my friends again. If I've got any left, who knows? You never know. Anything can happen these days.
You might have 1,000 new online friends now if you keep hosting these
That's
events.
true. That's true. That's true. And the good thing is, with online, I can just ignore them. If I don't want to accept a call or something like that, I'm just like, oh, not right now. I don't have to come up with some excuse or something like that. If you're just joining us, you can leave your camera on if you want already. We will be recording this session. If you're a bit camera shy, you can turn it off and also mute your microphone, of course, so that there are no accidental interruptions throughout the session.
Great to see so many people joining today.
Absolutely. Second to last YFS in conversation with. I feel like just yesterday when we got started with these things, but now we're already done. I've completely lost track of time.
What's been the average turnout for one of these events?
You know, I gave up trying to estimate turnout numbers. We started off with really high numbers, triple digits. I think it depends on the time of day as well and how people feel. It varies because we're at home the whole day sitting in front of our computer and then have to sit an hour more in front of our computer. For some people, that might be a bit too much screen time. So it really varies from day to day and topic to topic. But it looks like we're getting a good number tonight, so that's awesome.
Yeah, I think that turned into I've completely
All right, so it's now a few minutes after 3 and the majority of our participants have joined us today. So I would like to officially start this Youth Forum Switzerland in Conversation with event. Welcome everyone and thank you for joining us today. My name is Margot Lurie and I will be your MC for this session. I'm currently in grade 9 at the International School of Zug in Lucerne, and I've been a member of the YFS team since the start of the year, hosting the student TED Talks at our event in January. This afternoon's event is the 5th in our online series of discussions with key supporters of the Youth Forum. As a team, we hope that our time together today provides a positive break from the recent stressors during lockdown, and we wish to give you, the audience, a chance to interact with leading changemakers and inspiring experts. Our guest today fulfills the latter and has become a real friend of the forum. It is my great pleasure to welcome Professor Dr. Johannes Bohacek, a professor of neuroscience at the ETH, where his research focuses on the connection between stressful life events and anxiety disorders, speaking further about the effects of stress on the brain today. I would now like to hand over to Alex, who is managing our call today and collecting audience questions.
Thanks, Margot. My name is Alex Cervera, and I'll be managing tech and questions this afternoon. Please can I remind you to keep your mics muted for the first 45 minutes. Our call is also being recorded, so if you have an issue with being filmed, please also keep your camera off. Otherwise, you're welcome to have it on. It's great to see our audience. We have about 45 minutes together, during which time Fabrizio will be conducting a Q&A with Professor Dr. Bohacek. Please feel free to use the chat box to share a question with me at any time during the conversation, and I'll ask it at an appropriate moment. After 45 minutes, we would like to invite anyone with additional questions to a 15-minute chat. Otherwise, you are free to leave the meeting. So without further ado, I'd like to pass over to our host and interviewer for the session, Fabrizio.
Thanks a lot, Alex. Thank you to all of our audience members who are joining us tonight for this second to last edition of YFS in Conversation With. But most importantly, thank you so much to Professor Dr. Johannes Bohacek for joining us for this episode of YFS in Conversation With. How are you doing?
Doing very well. Thanks for having me. Hi, everyone.
Well, we're so glad to have you back. You actually were already attending YFS in January, and you know, your session was one of the most memorable experiences that students have talked about, that I've seen in the feedback. Everyone was talking about your talk that you gave at YFS 2020. So for all those of us who maybe don't remember it as much, or who were not able to attend because they were in another session, could you maybe give a brief overview of the talk that you gave at YFS 2020?
Sure. So first of all, I'm gonna, just because I realized I'm drinking from this every day. Can you see this? This was the gift I got from you guys.
That's incredible. I'm kind of jealous. I want one of those.
It's very good, very good. Limited edition. Okay, I'm gonna this time use a quick PowerPoint presentation. And I hope you can see the screen now.
Perfect.
Okay, so because it's challenging to give a short recap of a talk that was already very short, to get you all up to speed on the topic of stress research. So I have 4 slides here. It's going to be short, and the first one and the last one are really just intro and summary slides. So it's just 2 slides really. And what I'm showing on the first slide here, let me just adjust my own screen. What I'm showing you on the first slide is sort of the big key idea of our lab is we try to study the brain as it undergoes a stressful experience. So we're interested in the things that happen in the brain as an organism is facing stress. And I say organism because we do not work with humans, because we cannot study many of the things that we are interested in humans. So we, in fact, study animal models. And in this case, our subject is a mouse. And the stressor that the mouse is facing in this very moment is a life or death situation. It's being attacked by an eagle. And surprisingly, the stress response that this mouse is going to experience is very similar to the stress response that you and I would experience if we are facing a bank robbery, if we're being held at gunpoint, or if we're having a car accident, or even if it's something more everyday, like having an exam coming up the next day, a sports competition, anything that taps into our stress response system. And this is because the system has evolved over millions and millions of years from our early ancestors up to the present day to equip every organism with the ability to be as efficient and successful in surviving a stressful situation. And I hope I can get the screen. Yes. Okay. So my first take-home message, and I have 3. The first take-home message is that the stress response is highly conserved. This means we can study it in many different animals and make interpretations that are relevant for us as humans. So we do not need to study directly the human subject. If something is not clear, right, I hope you will interrupt me. This forum.
Well, follow-up questions lined up.
All right. Okay, good. Okay, so then what I want to give you is this quick overview of what happens in the brain as we experience a stressful situation. And this is really the summary of my talk in January. And I'm going to show you 3 stress systems here. The first one that you can see here is the noradrenaline system. And this is what happens in our brain the very second that we experience a stressful event. In that very moment, our brain is flooded with noradrenaline. That's a neurotransmitter that is released from a tiny brain structure. It's shown here that has the name locus coeruleus. And it's, if you sort of touch your ears with both fingers behind your ears, where your fingers would meet in the middle, that's where your locus coeruleus sits. And this tiny part of your brain produces large amounts of noradrenaline. And when it's activated, it floods your entire brain with noradrenaline. And the consequence of this is that you very rapidly change your brain function. And so you can stop whatever you're doing and you start focusing very intently on whatever stimulus is most important for survival. Or in an exam situation, hopefully you'll be able to focus very precisely on the question at hand, and you can access your memories and answer the question that you have to answer. Right? So this is your brain in an acute stress situation releasing noradrenaline. The second system also has to do with noradrenaline, but now it's not about the brain, but the rest of the body. And what you see here is the brain, and through the spinal cord here, you see how nerve fibers run throughout our entire body. And so the brain can innervate, it connects to all the organs in your body. And when the brain experiences a stressful situation or interprets something as stressful, it releases through these nerve endings that you see here in blue, noradrenaline again onto all of your organs. That is how your heart starts beating faster. That's how the vessels in your fingers will constrict, so you get cold hands. At the same time, the blood supply in your central organs, lungs, heart, increases. So you have more blood there. Your blood pressure goes up. Your pupils widen. Your mouth gets dry. You might start having shaky hands and legs. All the classic stress responses. And they serve one purpose and one purpose only, and that is to supply energy and to redirect energy to those places that need it the most. So your fingertips don't need much blood when you're trying to survive a stressful situation like the mouse facing the eagle. What needs energy are the big muscle groups and your lungs and heart, right? That needs energy. And that's how energy is being rerouted through this system that's called the sympathetic nervous system. And this is not only noradrenaline, as you see here on the left, but on the right, you also see adrenaline. And these are the things you all know about, right? The adrenaline rush that you get in a stressful situation is also activated by this system. That's where the brain reaches out to your adrenal glands, and the adrenals release adrenaline into the bloodstream. So your organs get this double hit. They get the direct impact from noradrenaline on this side and the indirect hit through the blood supply of adrenaline, both having the same activating energy supplying effect. So this is the second system. Now, both of these systems act very fast in the order of milliseconds to seconds from when you experience something stressful. And the third system is called the Hpa Axis. And that is because of these tricky names here. It's the hypothalamus, pituitary gland, and adrenal gland, HPA. And these brain structures and glands and organs are connected to, again, respond to stress and then release a hormone that you all know. That hormone is cortisol here. They release cortisol into the blood. And this system is slower. It takes a few minutes to kick in, and then cortisol travels through the blood, and it's a hormone that exerts its effects also more slowly because of biochemical and molecular mechanisms. So you have this third system that again supplies you with energy, but on a longer time scale. So if a stressor isn't over in a few seconds, but lasts for minutes or hours, cortisol is necessary to again provide you more energy. And it does that by changing your metabolism. So it changes how fat storage is turned into energy. And it also reduces the immune system, so you have less energy expenditure for immune functions and more energy available for surviving the stressful situation. So with this slide, if we forget about the complex systems, there are two take-home messages. The first one is that mind and body are obviously, as you see here, very tightly connected, and they're all activated by stress. So there's no point in trying to divide what is the brain and what is the body. They act in concert. And the third and final take-home message is the purpose of this, I repeat myself, is to supply energy. And that was kind of the key message of my talk in January, was to focus on the positive aspect, to say energy is a good thing, right? So we're happy if we have more energy. Sometimes we wish we had more when we get up in the morning and we're tired, or when we're at the end of a long lecture and we wish we could still be as energetic as we were at the beginning. And this is where the stress response comes in handy. It's good to have the energy. It has a downside, of course, and you can look at this from two angles. The first one is, if stress is chronic and long-lasting, your body has to keep supplying this high energy supply, and this can become a problem, because what you're going to do eventually, like all systems, if you have too much energy demand, you're going to run out of energy supply, meaning you're going to start having wear and tear on your organs. So you will have wasting away of muscle mass, you will have changes in your metabolism that are not advantageous, and you're going to start being more susceptible to all kinds of neurological disorders, because the brain is also struggling to cope with the high energy it's supplying to the system. So this is one of the bad aspects. And the second one is, if you do not think chronic stress, but acute stress, you know this situation maybe if you're in an exam situation and you've prepared and you know the stuff, but your stress system is activating you so strongly that instead of very focused, you're actually really freaked out, then you're having stage fright. And similar things happen during panic attacks, where instead of being focused on the stressful situation and trying to solve it efficiently, you go into this panic mode where your body is really just trying to fight or flight, and it's not focusing on problem solving. And so these are the bad things that can come with stress, and there are little tricks that we can use to try to calm down the stress response. And one that I've mentioned in January is breathing, which is a very simple thing. If you breathe in slowly and deeply, right? You have to do it with me, because we cannot resist if we see someone take a deep breath. We copy this. It's again evolutionary, built into us. If you just do this slow breathing, you tap into a feedback mechanism that slows down the way your locus coeruleus and your sympathetic nervous system are being activated. So this is a quick trick you can do whenever you feel a little bit stressed that will bring your stress level down just a little bit, right? It might not help you in a severe panic situation, but it's a little trick you can do before an exam or when you feel you're getting a little bit too nervous. Okay, so this was the recap of January's talk. I have one more slide for you on which I show you what we actually do in the lab, because I think today is a bit more about sort of behind the scenes of the nice TED Talks. So what I do all day is not give talks like this, but I work in a research lab. So we're trying to answer particular questions about how stress works. In this case, I formulated one of the questions that we work on, which is what happens molecularly in the brain. So what happens to the molecules in your brain as we experience a stressful situation? And in humans, we cannot investigate this, because if we want to get to the molecules, we have to take the brain out and process the brain, homogenize it, grind it up, and then look at the individual molecules in it and measure them and quantify them. And for this, we need to turn to animal models. And so a typical experiment in our lab that is run often by Lucas and Amalia, they're two senior researchers in my group, is they will expose a mouse to a stressful event. We let them swim for 6 minutes, for example, which they're very good at, but they really don't like, so it stresses them. And then we have to euthanize them and take out their brains and analyze. In this case, we can analyze different molecular changes that happen in the brain depending on when, after the stress, we collect the brain. And I give you one example, just a snapshot, where we look at gene expression. So you know that every cell in your body has access to your entire genetic information. And brain cells, when they face a stressful situation, they activate a very specific response profile to say, okay, we're going to need these kind of genes to be activated now, and we maybe don't need these kind of genes. And we can measure this very precisely and quantify all the 20,000 genes that we have in our body, which are all extremely similar to the mouse. And so data that we get is, for example, this one here, where we characterize over time, you see here 45 minutes, an hour and a half, 2 hours, and so forth, different time points after stress. We measure all those 20,000 genes and we compare in a stressed animal versus a non-stressed animal, what are the exact gene expression changes that we see? And if you see a red dot here, that means these are genes. Every dot is a gene that has a name, which I'm not showing you because it wouldn't be meaningful, but it means something to us. So every dot is a gene that is expressed more in a stressed animal than in a control animal. And every dot in blue is a gene that is actually reduced in response to stress. And you see that this response is very strong initially at 45 minutes and an hour and a half after stress. But as we're moving on with time, at the 4-hour time point, all the colors are gone. That means all the gene expression changes have resolved. The animal has in fact successfully coped with the stressful situation. It's all back to normal. And the reason we study this is because we hope that by understanding the molecular changes that are triggered by stress, we can understand what can go wrong, right? Why do some people develop anxiety disorders or depression when they're facing repeated stressors? And are there molecular switches that we can activate to treat diseases like this, right? Can we block a stress response, or can we make someone deal and cope better with stress? This is the kind of research that we do in the lab. And on my last slide, I always show the group members, so you have some kind of idea of who are the people behind this. So we're not a huge factory, right? We're a small group of something between 8 to 12 people. This fluctuates, and each of them has a specific project that they work on, very specific questions that they ask, and my job is to provide them with ideas and funding and oversight, and to keep the group together to make sure we're all working towards the same goal. And they use these techniques using pipettes and fancy machines and molecular biology in most of all to create the data like I've shown you on the previous slide. So this is a little bit of the daily life of us neuroscientists. And I hope this was somewhat informative for you. I will stop sharing my screen if I can figure out.
Thank you so much, Professor Bohacek. That was very informative. I've got a lot of questions based off of the presentation we just saw. And actually a question I got in my chat on Zoom, and I want to get this out of the way so we don't forget about it. The question of noradrenaline and adrenaline, how exactly does noradrenaline differ to normal adrenaline? Could you explain that to us?
Oh, okay. They're like brother and sister. So they're very, very closely related to each other. In fact, there are specific cells in your body that can produce noradrenaline. And some of those cells, they have an extra enzyme in there that can also produce adrenaline, So it removes the nor from the adrenaline, chemically speaking. And that leads to two molecules, adrenaline and noradrenaline, that are extremely similar, and their effects on the body are also almost identical. And these effects are to bind to receptors, right? So every molecule in the body, in order to have any effect on your body, needs to bind to a receptor. And these are like lock and key systems, right? So if this is the lock, there's a key that fits right in. And certain receptors are waiting for adrenaline to arrive, and then adrenaline comes in and binds the receptor, and that leads to a signal that travels down into the cell and can be interpreted by the body. This is how your heart starts increasing its rhythm, its firing, when its heartbeat, as it's receiving adrenaline or noradrenaline. And so they're really very similar, and it's just that in the brain, for reasons that I don't even actually know, in the brain we almost exclusively have noradrenaline, and in the body we have both, but we actually use adrenaline more than noradrenaline.
Thank you so much for that explanation. You mentioned in your talk about how, of course, you can't just take a human brain, blend it up, and look at that. You have to rely on animal models to get the data that you need to do your research. But perhaps then looking at the future of research and where it's going in terms of technology, would you say with the continuous advancement of technology that in the future, the way research is conducted, in your field especially, might be looking different? And if so, how do you think it could look down the road?
Yeah, that's a difficult question, actually, because the answer is yes and no. So yes, it will change, and it does change in the sense that we refine our methods, and if we don't have to go into the living animal, right, we try to find other ways. So if I want to know, for example, how does noradrenaline act on a given cell, then I don't need to use the whole animal. I can take that cell and grow it in a dish. Although the cell will always come from an animal, but I can grow this cell in a dish and create hundreds of these cells and then test noradrenaline on the cell without using a lot of animals. If I want to understand how the stress response works, right, we need a complex system where we have a brain that interprets a signal as stressful, that communicates with the body, that then receives a signal and then says, oh, I'm going to synthesize another hormone now. That hormone gets released into the bloodstream. The blood is connected to all the organs in the body. You have feedback loops, how the body talks back to the brain. And there is just no way, like logically, you cannot conceive of a way to replace this complexity by something like a cellular model or a computer model. This is simply not possible, unfortunately. So I think for a long time, we will rely on animal research to address the kind of questions that we have.
Thank you very much. That's a question probably a lot of people are asking themselves. A question I'm asking myself, and you've hinted at this during your slideshow presentation, it's that difference of how the whole system kicks in. If you're in an exam situation, and I can personally relate to this on a very, very deep level, there's this difference between you either focus on the question because you've revised and you know all of the content and you're able to focus on the question and get through it no problem, but then in other circumstances, you can into complete panic mode and completely lose focus and you forget everything that you've prepared and come to with the exam. So what exactly is responsible, I guess, for that key difference in how your body responds to that?
So from the way we understand this system, it really comes down to noradrenaline in this case. And maybe dopamine, which is another very similar neurotransmitter. And the reason I'm saying this is because there's actually a third point, right? So you have the extreme over response where you go into panic instead of focused attention. Then you have the middle where you have focused attention, you're in optimal performance mode. And then you have the lower end where you cannot mount sufficient attention to actually focus on the task in the first place. and that is the attention deficit disorder. And the way attention deficit is treated is by increasing noradrenaline and dopamine supply, particularly in your prefrontal cortex, in the frontal part of your brain. And this works very efficiently for people that do not have enough of these neurotransmitters around, so it can increase their performance. But if you're already at an optimal level, this can actually push you over the edge, so you become too activated, right? Similar to a panic response. And so I think what it really all comes down to is we all have individual normal baseline levels. If we're not stressed, if we're just you and I sitting around drinking a beer, then we might have our normal baseline level, and I might have a higher level than you, and the next person might have a higher level than me. And these things will reflect how our attention works at baseline. And then when we challenge the system, right, we might have a stronger or a weaker stress response on top of that. And wherever that puts you on the continuum, you might be going into a panic mode when you're experiencing a stressor, or you might just stay in the super efficient focused zone. And I think the best we can do is try to learn for ourselves little tricks, like the breathing is a simple example, to learn how can we control our own body to a certain degree. It's a tricky thing because our body does not like to be controlled that way, right? But we can learn a little bit to get control of it. And if that doesn't work just through meditation or breathing or conscious effort, then practice is one of those things that also helps us calm down, right? If you give the same speech 15 times, the first time you almost die, the 15th time you're bored, that's the same effect. So practice makes perfect, and practice also calms you down. And the ultimate solution is medical intervention, right? So if you know you're getting too stressed out, the most common treatment for stage fright is actually a beta blocker, which blocks these receptors that I mentioned earlier, where noradrenaline and adrenaline can bind. It blocks them. So noradrenaline cannot get in. So this is a medical way of reducing how your stress system gets activated.
We've got an audience question. So they ask, is there a specific age where people are more vulnerable to stress?
Wow, yeah, that's a very good question, and a tough one. So to try to give a smart answer to this, I will say something that I know for sure, and that's the good news. The good news is that young children apparently are very stress resilient. And I'm saying this is a good thing because they have very little control over their world, right? They depend on parents and caretakers to provide for them. And so that has been shown several times that the stress resilience is actually higher in children. That doesn't mean that you don't have to take care of children, quite the opposite, right? Because once you push them past their boundary of resilience, the effects are very bad and lifelong, because then you get programming effects. But that's a different topic. The good news is there are times where your resilience naturally is higher. And what I don't know actually is when that really ends, at what age, and when you become like the rest of us adults that are just normally stress susceptible. I think what I would come back to is age. As you get older, you've experienced more things, and you've experienced a lot of crappy things also, right? Amongst also the happy things, hopefully. And I think the more you go through, the more everything becomes relative, because you say, oh, you know, I've lost my parent already, so now the fact that I have this disease is maybe not as bad as losing someone that I love. And so everything becomes a little bit more relative. But that's almost a philosophical answer, not a hardcore neuroscience answer.
In your previous answer, when we talked about the treatments, you mentioned beta blockers, and one of the audience questions that I got is, could there be any long-term side effects of relying on beta blockers? Could there be perhaps any risks associated with taking meditation in order to curb these high stress levels?
Take medication. Yeah.
Yeah.
Of course, some medication always comes with side effects. There is no drug that does not have a side effect. The safety profile for beta blockers is very good because they've been used and are still used extensively as blood pressure medication. So I would consider them some of the safest drugs out there. That is not to say, hey, everyone should go and buy themselves some beta blockers. You do have side effects that are, God, I don't even know what they are. I think sexual function is not particularly benefiting from this. So I think there are serious reasons to be very careful when it comes to using medication. And as a scientist who works in this field, I would certainly say this is the last resort. But it is one of those drugs that, as far as I know, works safely and well, also in the long term. But this is all to be taken under doctor's guidance, of course.
Awesome, thank you so much. I did a bit of research and I looked a bit about what you've talked about before and also did some research myself. And the connection I came across, and maybe you could tell us a little bit more about this connection, is the connection between just having stressful life situations every now and then perhaps long-term anxiety disorders. Could you talk to us more about the link between the two that there is?
Yeah, God, I wish you would ask me something easy, like the simple stuff.
We'll get to the easy stuff afterwards.
Okay. Well, I'm saying this because just to remind also the audience, I am not a medical doctor, and I am certainly not a psychiatrist. So I cannot speak to many of these issues as an expert, right? I can only speak about sort of the basic fundamentals of how the stress response works and how we think of it in research. So with this disclaimer, we do study stress because we're interested in anxiety disorders, and we model this in our animals. And what we can see very reliably is if we expose an animal to a stressful situation, we do get an increase in anxiety right away. And as the stressor subsides, anxiety slowly starts going away as well. And that is the normal healthy course of events. Now, if you're experiencing chronic stress, you're essentially chronically turning on this stress/anxiety response. And that for some reason, in some individuals who are vulnerable, can lead to psychiatric anxiety disorders and also depression. These are the two most common risk factors associated with chronic stress. It's just explaining why that is a very complicated thing, right? It's not just noradrenaline, it's the mix of all the systems I've shown you earlier. This is a whole body response, and chronic release of all these hormones and neurotransmitters changes the way your brain works. And again, this is an adaptation, right? The body tries to adapt to chronically high stress levels. So I don't think I can satisfyingly answer your question, except to say that anxiety is a natural and useful response to stress, because it will increase your survival, right? If you realize you're in a dangerous environment, there's a lion lurking out there, then you have to be careful. And the anxious and hence more careful animal or human will survive because you're going to be more careful. And so that's good. But of course, if this gets to the point where you get so anxious that you never go outside again, you're going to starve to death. So somewhere in this continuum, we all have to find our way to survive.
So we've got another audience question. They're asking whether there are any long-term effects of having high levels of anxiety.
Well, I think having the high level of anxiety is the long-term effect in itself, right? That is, anxiety is a very unpleasant, if not debilitating feeling, right? So it depends how severe the anxiety is. Like I said, anxiety in its extreme form can lead to a panic attack. So you cannot have one panic attack after the other that is taking a toll on your system. So I'm not sure I'm understanding the question very well. I would consider anxiety is already the negative side effect, and it will change the way you live your life, obviously, right? You make adjustments. Like the example I said, people that have, for example, anxiety in public spaces, they will just avoid leaving the house. So yeah, this has a consequence, right? This will change your social connections. This might change your performance at school or at work. But I think this is a very trivial answer to probably a question that was more complex than that.
I've got just one more sort of, I guess, difficult question, and it's one I once again relate to. It's got to do with these kind of artificial stress situations where you're watching a violent or a scary movie, or you're playing a lot of video games where you're always under stressful situations. If you expose yourself to that kind of stressful situation frequently, could there be, just because of that, any long-term impact on your brain?
Yeah, so I think there should be, right? So our brain is designed to be plastic. And plasticity means, in neuroscience, plasticity means the ability to adapt. So if you keep triggering a system over and over again, and noradrenaline is a good example, right? So if you continuously keep releasing high amounts of noradrenaline, the brain and the entire body has ways to deal with this. And some of them are very simple, right? Remember the receptor that is waiting for the noradrenaline to arrive. Noradrenaline arrives, it binds the receptor, it's going to have some signaling effect. That happens over and over and over again. At some point, this receptor is just going to disappear. It's going to just, the cell is going to say, look, this is too much noradrenaline around. We're going to remove these receptors because we're getting too much activation. So this would be what we call habituation, where the same thing you experience over and over again is just not going to stress you anymore. And it's the same with, that's why I said, you practice the talk 15 times, you're going to be much more relaxed the 15th time. That's the habituation of a noradrenergic system and other systems in your brain, right? That all over and over experience the same thing again, and the brain changes. And the same for a video game, right? The first time you're going to be freaking out, you're covered in sweat, and the 200th time you're playing it, you're just doing it automatically. So I think you've all experienced this. We all have.
All right, we have roughly 5 minutes left of the Q&A portion, so probably time for one more question.
All right, I've got one last question to wrap up the official Q&A portion, and that is, to any future aspiring doctors or aspiring scientists that we've got sitting in the audience today, or perhaps worldwide, what is one important piece of advice you would want to give to them on their future journey?
Oh God, I hope the whole world isn't listening to this answer. God, I'm not sure if I'm the right person to give this advice. My personal experience was that it does pay off to give 100%. In whatever you do, that is my personal experience. It does matter, right? So that means how you perform in a project, how you lead your friendships. I think it does make sense to focus on the things that you want to do that are important, and do them with all your heart and try to do them well. So maybe we can talk about this later, but if I look at my own life path, I didn't always know what I was doing, but looking back at it, I tried to do it well, and I was kind of lucky to end up in a good place. So for me, this has become a guiding principle. I don't know if this works for everyone, but I think it's good advice.
Okay, our 45-minute Q&A session with Professor Bohacek has now come to an end, but if you have further questions that you would like to ask him personally, please feel free to stay on the call for another 15 minutes. I'm sure that everyone would agree it was a privilege to hear about the effects of stress on the brain. And before some audience members leave the session, I would like to remind you that our next In Conversation With event is tomorrow at 6:30 with Dr. Michael Head regarding the impacts of COVID-19. We hope to see you all again at that session, and with that, feel free to turn on your cameras and wave goodbye to Professor Bohacek before leaving the call. Thank you.
Wow, this is fun. Bye.
For those of you who've got more questions that you want to ask Professor Bohacek, you are welcome to stay in the chat, of course. Also, if you just want to listen in till the end of the call, you're welcome to stay in, of course, as well.
Okay, so it's great to see so many people have stayed to ask Mr. Bohacek some more questions. For this part of the session, please physically raise your hand, and then you can turn on your mic and ask Mr. Bohacek a question.
And please just call me Johannes. This is incredibly awkward. In science, we go on a first name basis. So makes talking to each other also much more pleasant and low key.
Appreciate it. Thank you a lot, Johannes. I think we've got a person here. See what they want to say. I think the person got stage fright. They forgot how to speak. Well, I've got a lot more questions lined up for you, Professor Johannes. It's a habit I've got to break now. I want to talk a bit more then about the path that brought you to where you are today, working, of course, at Hpa, one of the most well-known universities in the world. Could you give us a little bit of background of how exactly you ended up, not right in this very moment talking to us, but ended up working at Hpa as a research professor?
Yeah, I wish I could tell you that this was sort of a perfectly planned life strategy that I started very early and then pursued with great determination, but it really wasn't. So it's a long journey, largely based on serendipity. And I think the only red thread is, like I mentioned, sort of trying to be really good at the things I did along the way, even if they were not remotely related to the things I do today. So to make this short, I started, before I finished high school, I thought I would become a psychotherapist. And that was really because I somehow had, and I think still have, the quality that if you sit down with me, for some reason, you want to tell me all of your problems, which is totally fine with me. So I love listening, and I like to hear what's going on in people's lives. So I thought I would become a psychotherapist, and I started studying psychology. And that was still in Austria, where I'm from. And my first lecture was actually it was called biopsychology, and that is the study of how the brain controls our behavior. And I fell in love, and one of the first things that the professor said was, if you want to do science, go to America, go to the US to study. And so I did sign up for an exchange program and got accepted. And again, these are little things where, you know, if you have good grades, you increase your chances of getting accepted to the exchange program, even if it's psychology and not neuroscience or whatever you want to do. And so I ended up at a university that was really in no man's land in Arkansas, in Little Rock, Arkansas. So somewhere in the southern US that I had never heard of. I thought I would go to LA or New York. And so I studied psychology there. And then one of my professors, again, because I was just working very hard and enjoyed what I did, told me that you can actually do a PhD and you get paid for it, which I had no idea that you get paid if you do a doctorate degree, PhD. And so I applied for one of these programs, and because I was very late in applying, so every year you have cycles of applications, and I applied very late. So one of the only schools that was still accepting applications was in New Orleans in the US. And so that's where I ended up. And obviously without plan, without really having any clue, and got into applied biopsychology, which is the study of how the brain and behavior are connected. And then as I was in New Orleans in 2005, Hurricane Katrina hit, which forced me to evacuate and take a sort of 6-month break somewhere else in the US. Then I came back to New Orleans. I switched into a neuroscience program, eventually got my PhD in neuroscience. And then I had met my now wife during the evacuation, during the hurricane. So it's a messed up story. And we decided we want to go back to Europe. So I looked for jobs in Europe, and I found the University of Zurich, which there was a professor who did something that I was very interested in. So I applied for her lab, and I got accepted again. So I moved back, and that's how I ended up in Switzerland. And because I was lucky and I worked hard and published a few decent papers, I was then able to apply for a professorship at the ETH. And these things are sort of, that's always out of your control, really. You can just try, and if you're at the right place at the right time and you're the person they're looking for, then you might just end up there. And so I did somehow get it. And now for 3 years, I have this really cool job of being a professor at the ETH, which is an incredible privilege. And I try to give back as much as I can, because I think I've received a lot of good things from good people along the way. And yeah, that's it. So you see a lot of serendipity.
I've just got a quick question. I was just wondering if you have any tips for like techniques that all of us can implement to minimize stress in our daily lives?
Yeah, techniques to alleviate and reduce stress. I think really, it sounds like a cliche, so I'm very sorry to say, but meditation is maybe the most powerful way to reduce stress levels purely from a body level perspective, right? You can teach, but with meditating, you teach your body how to relax. And there are very well-established meditation techniques like mindfulness meditation. That is something you can Google, and you find great tutorials that are often coupled to breathing techniques. That's why it always goes hand in hand with breathing and meditation. That what it does, it calms down your sympathetic nervous system. That is the system that gets activated during stress. So medically, it makes a lot of sense, and it's used also at the top institutions, right? The University Hospital in Zurich, they use mindfulness meditation for cancer patients that have terminal cancer, right? Which is maybe the worst thing you can have in life. It's a death sentence, and it's a new situation in life you have to deal with that is often associated with very high stress levels, anxiety, depression, all these things. And meditation is on their list of interventions, right? Guided meditation. So I think this is really something that you can start early on. It sounds like it's something for old people, I know, but it's good. So that's one thing. Maybe easier for younger people is exercise, right? Exercise has a wonderful effect on the body, and it does what it does. It sort of brings your body into homeostasis again. And stress is constantly trying to push you out of, when you're stressed, you're out of homeostasis. That means you're out of balance, and the stress system is trying to bring you back in. And exercise is just this reset system. It has like tons of positive effects on the body, and is obviously healthy, right? So whenever I say these things, I sound like a guru, right? They always preach the same things: meditate, exercise, eat healthy. There is unfortunately a reason, because these are the only things we can really do, and we can do them easily, in fact. and they're all proven to alleviate stress. And there was in fact a study, or there is an ongoing study now during the Corona crisis that's headed by the Swiss Stress Network, which I'm part of. And this is a colleague from Bern. He tests from Basel, sorry, and he tests the stress response and how stressed people feel during COVID. And he finds this correlation that those that do more exercise feel less stress, right? Of course, that's just a correlation, but it could be that if you have more time to do exercise, right, you might be less stressed. I certainly don't have as much time as I would like to have, but I think there's something behind this. So these are the simple things. I could go on, but I think this is stuff you can quickly implement in your daily life. Excuse me.
I've just got one last question before we wrap this whole thing up, and that is, you're working, of course, at ETH, and what is it like to work at a university like ETH? How does it differ, perhaps, from working just purely at a research lab? Of course, when you're actually in ETH and not having to do some of the lectures from home, but what's it like to work at ETH?
Do you mean in comparison to doing the same job at a different university?
Yeah. What's it like your day-to-day? What are some highlights? How does your day run, sort of that kind of sense?
Sorry, again, just to clarify, do you ask what I do on a day-to-day basis, or what the highlights are of being at ETH on a daily basis?
What do you do on a daily basis? Sorry for any confusion there.
Okay. No, it's good. Oh God, my day is kind of disappointingly boring, I think, because I sit behind a computer in my office most of the time. So if this happens to be at home or in my real office, it doesn't make so much of a difference. The people in my group, they come to me, and I end up having a lot of meetings where we just discuss the data they've collected, the experiments they plan. So it's really a lot of thinking and reading about what are the most interesting questions in our field, in the field of stress. And it's a lot of writing emails and organizing to make sure people in my lab can do the experiments they want to do, right? This means you have to write licenses to get approval to do animal experiments. You need to collect money to make sure that these very expensive things can actually be run. And then when the results come in, you need to fact check, you need to make sure that everything is sound, and then you try to write them up and publish them as research papers. That's my daily life. But I would squeeze this one in. The highlight of being at a place like ETH, as compared to many other schools that are not as high level, high caliber as the ETH, is that you're really exposed to just incredible talent every day, right? I will readily admit that most of the people that work with me are smarter than me, and they can do things that impress me, or I have no idea how to do it, but I can just sort of try to, put them in the right place where they can do the things that they do. And I think this is really one of the top privileges of being at the ETH. And the other one is having access to money, right? Money is very important. You can't do research without funding. And since it's all competitive, the one with the most research funding can do the best science. So this is all one cycle that we're stuck in for better or for worse. So you have access to talent, you have access to funding, and you have access to the latest techniques, the best equipment. That is all something that makes it worth fighting for to get into such a good place. Yeah.
Thank you very much for your time today, Professor Bohacek. I'm going to hand it over to Margot, our MC for today, and she'll end off this call. Thank you so much for all of your answers.
Thanks for having me.
Unfortunately, that's all the time we have today. Thank you again to Professor Bohacek for being so gracious and helping us host a truly insightful discussion, as well as continuing to support the Youth Forum Switzerland. Thank you to everyone who has stayed to ask further questions, and don't forget, our next event is tomorrow evening at 6:30. We hope to see you there. Thank you again and have a great evening.